Chapter 1. Shadows Beneath the Light. What kind of secret could a battered old briefcase hold that would make a widow risk everything? In a courtroom buzzing with whispers and judgment, Maya Jackson clutched it like a lifeline, her dark eyes burning with a fire no one expected. By the end of the day, the truth inside would unravel a web of lies and leave even the most ruthless lawyer speechless. The air in the small courtroom of Franklin County, just outside Atlanta, Georgia, hung heavy with tension on that humid March morning in 2025. Maya Jackson stood alone at the plaintiff's table, her calloused hands gripping her late husband Daniel's worn leather briefcase. Her heart pounded beneath her modest gray dress, and every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape the piercing stares of the mostly white spectators and the smug grin of Victor Steele. The infamous attorney seated across the room. Steele leaned back in his chair, his tailored suit a stark contrast to her thrift store attire, and sneered, "No proof, Your Honor. Just another desperate woman trying to cling to something that doesn't belong to her." The words stung, sharp and deliberate, and Maya felt the weight of every eye in the room. Victor's tone dripped with condescension, and when he said, "woman," it carried an edge, an unspoken implication that she, a black widow from the wrong side of town, couldn't possibly have a legitimate claim. Beside him sat Jerome Jackson, Daniel's estranged younger brother, his arms crossed and his face etched with a confidence that made Maya's stomach churn. Jerome had been called Mr. Jackson by Steele with a nod of respect earlier, while she was just her, or this woman, a subtle jab that didn't escape her notice. For 6 months, Maya had endured the whispers behind her back. "She's after his money," they'd said in the grocery store aisles. "People like her don't own houses like that without some trick." Daniel's death in a car crash on a rain-slicked road had shattered her world, leaving her with nothing but memories, a modest home, and a savings account he'd worked tirelessly to build. Then Jerome had stormed in like a hurricane, contesting Daniel's will and accusing her of forgery. The will, signed and notarized, left everything to Maya, yet Jerome claimed it was a lie. And Victor Steele had taken up his cause with a zeal that bordered on cruelty. Maya tightened her grip on the briefcase, its cracked leather warm against her palms. Daniel wouldn't have wanted her to back down. She could still picture him, his broad shoulders hunched over the hood of a car in his garage, his warm laugh filling their tiny kitchen. He'd been a mechanic, a man who fixed things, who built a life for them despite the sideways glances from neighbors who assumed he'd never amount to much. Now, that life was under attack, and this briefcase was her last tether to him. The judge, a stern man with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, banged his gavel. "Order," he called, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Mrs. Jackson, you've made a claim. Let's hear it." Victor rose, his movements smooth and theatrical, his voice slicing the air like a blade. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Jerome Jackson, has been unfairly accused by this woman, who seeks to profit from a fraudulent claim. There's no evidence to support her case, just the word of someone with everything to gain." His gaze landed on Maya, sharp and dismissive, as if she were a child caught in a lie. The spectators murmured again, and Maya's chest tightened. She forced herself to breathe, to focus on the weight of the briefcase in her hands. It wasn't just leather and memories, it held the truth. 6 months ago, after the funeral, she'd left the briefcase untouched in their bedroom closet, a relic too painful to face. But one stormy night, with thunder rattling the windows, she'd finally opened it. Amid old receipts and car manuals, she'd found an envelope tucked into a hidden pocket. Her hands had trembled as she unfolded the letter inside. Daniel's familiar scrawl leaping off the page. "Maya," it began, "if you're reading this, something's gone wrong. Jerome's been after the house for years. He owes me more than he'll ever admit. Don't let him take what we built. Everything's in here." Attached were dates, amounts, a record of loans Jerome had never repaid, a betrayal Daniel had foreseen. Now, standing in court, Maya summoned every ounce of courage. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Your Honor," she said, "I have evidence that will change everything." A gasp rippled through the room, and for the first time, Victor's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second, before he recovered with a scoff. "Absurd," he snapped. "Another baseless attempt to waste this court's time. Maya set the briefcase on the judge's desk with a soft thud, her fingers brushing the leather one last time before she opened it. The room fell silent as she pulled out the envelope and placed it before the judge. "This is from my husband, Daniel," she said, her voice soft but firm. "He knew this might happen. He left proof that Jerome lied, that he owed Daniel money he never paid back. It's all here." The judge adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable as he took the envelope and slid out the letter. The tension in the room thickened. Every eye locked on his hands. Victor crossed his arms, his jaw tight, while Jerome shifted uncomfortably in his seat. When the judge finally spoke, his tone was measured but heavy. "This document, it warrants a closer look." The courtroom erupted in whispers, and Jerome shot to his feet. "She's lying," he shouted, his face flushed. "She made it up. She's always been jealous." Victor placed a hand on his arm, urging him to sit, but his own composure was cracking, a bead of sweat glinting on his forehead. As the judge called for a recess, Maya stepped into the hallway, her heart pounding. Clarence Brown, a retired lawyer who'd been her neighbor for years, approached with a reassuring smile. "You did good in there," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "Daniel would be proud." She nodded, but her mind raced. She'd delivered the evidence, but she knew this fight was far from over. The letter was her weapon. Yet the looks on Victor's and Jerome's faces told her they wouldn't go down quietly. As she glanced back at the courtroom doors, a chill ran through her. The truth was out, but at what cost? Chapter 2. The Long Night and the Ghosts. The night after the courtroom showdown wrapped Maya Jackson in a suffocating silence, broken only by the creak of her front door swinging ajar. She stepped inside her small home on the edge of Franklin County, her breath catching as she saw papers strewn across the living room floor, receipts, bills, Daniel's old sketches of car engines, all torn from their drawers. The bedroom door hung open, and her heart sank. The briefcase, her lifeline to Daniel's truth, was gone. Panic clawed at her chest as she stood frozen, the faint scent of rain and mud lingering in the air. She'd left the courtroom that afternoon with a flicker of hope. The judge's words, "This document warrants a closer look," echoing in her mind. But now, that hope felt like a cruel joke. A soft creak from the back of the house snapped her out of her daze. Grabbing a heavy cast iron skillet from the kitchen counter, she crept toward the sound, her voice trembling but resolute. "Who's there? Show yourself." A shadow shifted in the dim light of the back porch, a man in a black hoodie, clutching the briefcase, their eyes locked for a tense heartbeat, his face obscured by the hood. Before he bolted through the open door, "Stop!" Maya shouted, chasing him into the night. Her bare feet slapped against the wet grass, but he vanished into the darkness beyond the fence, leaving her breathless and empty-handed. She sank to her knees, tears mixing with the drizzle on her face, the weight of loss crashing over her again. The police arrived half an hour later, their cruiser rolling up with a laziness that stung. Officer Hargrove, a middle-aged white man with a permanent frown, stepped out, his flashlight sweeping the yard. "So, you're saying someone broke in and took a briefcase?" he asked, his tone flat, skeptical. "You sure it wasn't an ex or a boyfriend?" "Ma'am, this place doesn't look like it's got much worth stealing." Maya bristled at the implication, her hands clenching. "It was my husband's," she said sharply. "It had evidence for a case. Someone knew what they were after." Hargrove scribbled something in his notepad, but his shrug told her he didn't care enough to dig deeper. By morning, Maya's resolve had hardened into something fierce. She called Clarence Brown, the retired lawyer who'd stood by her in court. He arrived at her doorstep within the hour, his graying hair tucked under a cap, his eyes sharp despite his years. "They're scared," he said, stepping over the mess in her living room. "That's why they took it." "But Daniel was smarter than that, wasn't he?" Maya nodded, her mind racing back to the stormy night she'd found the letter. If Daniel had hidden one piece of proof, maybe he'd left more. Together, they headed to the garage, Daniel's sanctuary, a cluttered space of tools and oil-stained rags. Untouched since his death, dust coated every surface, a testament to the months she'd avoided this place. Maya ran her fingers along the workbench, memories flooding back. Daniel whistling as he fixed a neighbor's carburetor, his hands steady and sure. She paused at a locked metal cabinet in the corner. Its key long lost. He kept stuff in here, she said, her voice thick. Clarence handed her a crowbar from the shelf. Then let's find out what. The lock gave way with a groan, revealing a small tin box inside. Maya's hands shook as she opened it. And there it was. Another envelope. Thicker than the first. Stuffed with papers. Daniel's handwriting greeted her again. Maya. If they take the first one. This'll be here. Jerome's debts. Every cent he owes me. Every lie he told. Keep fighting. Attached were cancelled checks. Signed IOUs. Proof that Jerome had borrowed thousands from Daniel to cover gambling losses. Never intending to repay. Relief washed over her, mingling with a renewed fire. He knew, she whispered. He knew they'd come for me. Back in court the next day, Maya walked in with the tin box under her arm. Clarence at her side. Victor Steele's smirk returned as she approached the judge's desk. But it didn't reach his eyes. Your Honor, Maya said, her voice steady. They stole the briefcase, but Daniel left me this. She handed over the envelope, watching as the judge sifted through the documents, each one a nail in Jerome's coffin. Victor leapt up, his voice sharp. This is preposterous. She's fabricated these to save her crumbling story. But the judge held up a hand, his gaze fixed on a check signed by Jerome himself. Jerome's composure cracked. She's twisting everything, he shouted, his face flushed with anger. Those are lies, she's desperate. Victor gripped his shoulder, hissing for him to sit. But the damage was done. The spectators buzzed, and Maya caught a flicker of doubt in their murmurs, doubt aimed at Jerome. Not her. Then, an unexpected voice cut through the chaos. Ruth Carter, an elderly black woman from down the street, shuffled to the witness stand. I saw Jerome at Daniel's house a week before the crash, she said, her voice frail but firm. He was yelling, saying he'd get that house one way or another. Victor's face twisted. This woman's senile, Your Honor, she can't be trusted. But the judge's stern look silenced him. I'll decide what's trustworthy, Mr. Steele. Mrs. Carter, continue. Ruth nodded, her eyes meeting Maya's. Daniel told me he was worried about Jerome. Said he'd fixed the will to protect Maya. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the judge called for a recess to review the new evidence. Maya stepped outside, her pulse racing. Clarence clapped a hand on her shoulder. You're turning the tide, he said, but Steele's not done yet, he'll come back harder. Maya nodded, her jaw tight. She'd expected Jerome's denial, Victor's venom, but Ruth's words had lit a spark in her. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt the shadows shifting, light creeping in where darkness had reigned. That night, as she sat in her ransacked living room, Maya traced the edges of Daniel's letter from the tin box. Keep fighting, he'd written. She wouldn't stop, not until the truth burned away every lie they'd thrown at her. The ghosts of doubt and theft lingered, but she was ready for the next battle. Chapter 3. The light breaks through. The final day in the Franklin County courtroom dawned with a heaviness that pressed against Maya Jackson's chest. The air thick with anticipation and unspoken judgment. She sat at the plaintiff's table, the tin box of Daniel's backup evidence resting before her like a shield. Its contents now known to the judge and Brawl ready to face Victor Steele's final assault. Across the room, Steele adjusted his tie with a practiced calm. But the tightness in his jaw betrayed him, his polished armor was cracking. The session began with a flurry of venom. Victor stood, his voice smooth but edged with desperation. Your Honor, we've uncovered evidence that Mrs. Jackson forged these so-called documents after her husband's death, he declared, sliding a stack of papers across the desk, letters and timestamps that claimed Daniel's will had been altered posthumously. Maya's stomach dropped, but Clarence Brown leaned close, whispering, he's bluffing. Watch. The judge peered at the papers. Then at the originals Maya had submitted, the notarized will, the checks, Jerome's IOUs. Mr. Steele, the judge said, his tone dry. These signatures were verified by a notary months before Mr. Jackson's accident. Explain that discrepancy. Victor's face flushed, but he pressed on, turning to the gallery. She's manipulated this narrative, hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on my client. His accusation hung in the air, and Maya caught a murmur from the B gallery. a white man in a plaid shirt whispering to his neighbor. I don't buy it. She's not smart enough to pull this off. The words stung, but she met his gaze, unflinching, until the judge snapped, quiet in the gallery, or you're out. The man shrank back, chastened, and Maya felt a flicker of triumph. She rose, her knees trembling but her voice steady. Your Honor, I don't have money for investigators. All I have is what Daniel left me, his truth. He was a mechanic, a good man who worked hard for everything we had. Jerome wanted it all, and he lied to get it. These papers prove that. She gestured to the tin box, her eyes locking with the judge's. Daniel trusted me to fight for what's right. I won't let him down. The courtroom hushed as she spoke, her words cutting through Victor's bluster. She told their story. Daniel saving for years to buy their little house. Teaching kids in the neighborhood how to fix bikes. Always believing in a better tomorrow despite the whispers that a black man like him couldn't rise above. Jerome came to him for help, she said, and Daniel gave it. Loans. Second chances. But Jerome betrayed him. That's what this case is about. Victor scoffed, but the judge silenced him with a look. Then Ruth Carter's testimony echoed in the room, her frail voice recounting Jerome's threats. The evidence piled up, checks, letters, a paper trail of greed, and Jerome's denials grew weaker. His shouts of, she's lying, sounding hollow. Victor's composure unraveled. He snapped at Ruth. You're confused, old woman. Only to earn a sharp rebuke from the judge. Control yourself, counselor, or I'll hold you in contempt. Hours later, the jury filed back in, their faces unreadable. Maya clutched Clarence's hand under the table, her breath shallow. The foreman, a wiry man with tired eyes, stood. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Maya Jackson. The words hit her like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room. A sob broke from her throat, raw and unrestrained, as relief and grief crashed together. She'd done it. Daniel's trust, his love, had carried her through. The gallery erupted, gasps and murmurs swelling into a roar. Jerome leapt up, his face a mask of fury. This is a setup. She doesn't deserve a damn thing. But the judge's gavel slammed down, and two bailiffs moved toward him. Mr. Jackson, the judge said, his voice cold. Evidence suggests you've committed perjury and fraud. You'll face charges accordingly. Jerome's bravado crumbled. He sank into his chair, head bowed, the weight of his lies pinning him down. Victor sat motionless, his reputation in tatters. The man in the plaid shirt who doubted Maya stared at the floor, avoiding her gaze as the judge continued. Mrs. Jackson has proven her claim beyond doubt. The estate is hers, as per her husband's will. Maya's eyes burned with tears, but she held her head high. Those who'd whispered behind her back, the neighbors, the skeptics, now faced the truth. She'd fought, and she'd won. As the courtroom emptied, Clarence squeezed her shoulder. You turned their shadows into light, he said, pride in his voice. Maya nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. She stepped outside, the Georgia sun warm on her face, and felt the burden lift, for the first time in months. She could breathe. Weeks later, Maya stood in Daniel's garage, now transformed into a small workshop. She'd opened it to the neighborhood kids, teaching them to fix bikes and change oil. Just as Daniel had, the tin box sat on a shelf, a quiet reminder of her victory. She pulled out his letter, tracing the words, "Keep fighting. Thank you, Daniel," she whispered, her voice steady, "for believing in me." The evening breeze carried the sound of laughter from the kids outside, their voices mingling with the hum of a drill. Maya flipped on the garage light, its glow spilling into the dusk, a beacon of resilience, a testament to the life she and Daniel had built. She thought of Jerome, now facing trial, and Victor, whose career had taken a hit he'd never recover from. They'd underestimated her, judged her by the color of her skin and the modesty of her life. But justice had prevailed. Maya tucked the letter back into its envelope and turned to the workbench, picking up a wrench. The kids needed her, and she needed this: purpose, peace, a legacy worth protecting. The shadows of doubt and betrayal had faded, replaced by a light she'd forged herself. She smiled, soft but fierce, and stepped outside to join the laughter. The fight had changed her, but it had also revealed her strength, a strength no one could take away.